Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the course so far. I'm just going to make a summary here, a little summary of the second week video lectures, I guess. And the reason for that is just to try and bring these together into themes. In a longer course, we do this in discussion, or on an in-person class, we obviously do it by talking, but we don't have the time, so I'm just going to try and keep these really brief because I only have 15 minutes because I have the free version of this app. So when we begin this week, we're talking about slavery and specifically the institution of chattel slavery, right? And what we see in this institution, that's why I've called it the peculiar institution, it is distinct, right? We will see this nonsense argument that slavery existed in other places. Well, it's not a nonsense argument, but it's not the same thing. The idea that you fully own somebody, they're subject to your will, and that you own their children is a unique construction of chattel slavery, something which began happening in the Americas from about the 1500s to the 1800s, right? It begins with Europeans, and it begins with trade, right? There's this gun-slave hypothesis. The idea the guns go to Africa, the guns destabilize the countries. When the countries are destabilized, prisoners of war are taken. Those prisoners of war are sold as slaves. The slaves are traded for more guns. The guns cause more destabilization, and so on and so on, right? And it begins this principle that the state has and has had for a very long time, right, of destabilizing other polities in order to economically benefit from them. One could argue that things have not changed very much since then in terms of this broad principle, but the way that they economically benefit from them obviously has, right? I just returned from Syria, where the US has plenty of bases and they extract oil, but what they don't do is stop bombs and drones bombing little children. It's not a vastly distinct thing, right? It is a different thing, but this principle of extraction still remains. This is a triangle trade. If you went to high school in America, you learned about this. If you didn't, check out that lecture. The slave gun cycle we've discussed, right? This is the idea that slavery in Africa, we see this sometimes deployed largely by people trying to mitigate the evil of slavery that happened here and in other countries in the Americas. These people were not, they were prisoners of war. They were not enslaved in the same way. Often they were brought into that community and they worked in that community, but it wasn't this big sort of industrial exploitation of human beings that we saw on plantations in the South, for instance, right? We can see the Emanuel case is very interesting and is discussed at more length in that lecture, right? But it indicates the racial nature of slavery. Plantations, as we can see, right? Life expectancy was 23 years. We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution next week, but it is the industrial exploitation of human capital, right? It is the beginnings of this system whereby we have people who labor and we have people who exploit that labor and generate income from it, right? Now, obviously, this is an extreme case of that, but the phrase wage slavery is often used to describe the early industrial revolution because conditions there were destitute and terrible too. That does not mean it is the same as chattel slavery, and I don't think anyone's seeking to imply that, or at least anyone in good faith should not be. Again, these court cases are very interesting because they show us sort of that they ask us to examine exactly what is meant by slavery and who can be a slave, and specifically the racial elements of slavery, right? It's a decent film. If you want to watch a film, a trailer for you there. Okay, so we're talking about the Americas, right? So we'll start with the United States of Americas. Again, this is something that many of you will have covered to such a great degree in high school. I don't think we need to go over the who's and what's and where's of the American War of Independence, American Revolution, whatever you want to call it, right? Because it's the thing that I will say that what I'd like to add to this is not who did what, where, and why. It's the things that came afterwards, right? The compromises that were made in the Constitution, both in who is counted and this compromise that has to happen between liberty and property, right? Or it doesn't have to happen, but the decision is made, right? if we hold that all men are created equal, why are some of them owned by others? And so there is a decision made that there will be a compromise made, right? That liberty will not be absolute, but it will only be applied to certain people. That liberty is not for people who are enslaved. And that is a compromise between liberty and property, essentially, right? This is Beard's argument that it's an economic document for an economic end. I think that's something of a vulgar, and that vulgar's the wrong word, a coarse Marxist analysis, I guess, but I think it bears reading, and I hope that you will take the time to engage with that and consider that. Of course, right, we know that the Iroquois Confederacy already had many of the elements that sort of bring together a federal system, right? Now, because the United States borrowed some of these, does not mean that they viewed these people in an equal fashion. For his Benjamin Franklin, right, it will be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages, I'm quoting, should be capable of forming such a union, and yet it has subsisted for ages and appears indissoluble, and yet, like a union, should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies. Right, this is the use of English should be noted. Like this is not so much national or state as in terms of like race, ethnicity, and culture, but it is worth noting that the indigenous peoples of the United States were not, as they're far too often portrayed in our understanding of American history, living this sort of nasty, brutish, and short life. They had complicated relations, political systems, and again, like the idea of the United States as a terra nullius, this land without people, is absolute nonsense. The idea of people settling a land, that people have been settled there for generations, right? This was not a place that lacked humans. It was a place where humans were living happily until other humans came and destabilized and sought to extract from them. These are the racial categories, right? In Latin America, fascinating to see all these different racial hierarchies that one could fit into, right? Venezuela. This, you guys can see this more in detail in the lecture, right? Is again this idea of liberty, but this time spreading and being implemented in a slightly different way. Specifically because we have this Criollo class, right? The Creole people, people of mixed race, or sort of multiracial, biracial people, and therefore we see this doesn't mean that slavery does not exist in the whole of South America. It certainly does in Brazil, but we see a slightly different interpretation of the same idea, right? This Enlightenment idea of liberty. Here's Simon Bolivar. Many of you will be familiar with him, perhaps some of you will not. I've written a little bit about him here. Many of you will know who the guy in the tracksuit is. If you don't, it's Hugo Chavez. He's holding the Bolivarian Constitution of Venezuela. Dude who is now dead. Venezuela, not a place you probably want to live right now. I lived there when I was younger. It's certainly like the veneration of Bolivar there is on a par with the veneration of founding fathers in the United States. So Brazil, of course, because we have Portuguese colonialism, we have slightly different context, right? Which is what I've tried to summarize here. Again, you can see more in that lecture. Briefly, to bring us back to nations and nationalism, which is what we spoke about. Many of these nations are fused in these conflicts. The idea of who is us and who is them. If we want a shortcut to find out who the nation is, it's the salient we in these conflicts, right? Who is our nation? Now, that's an interesting question to ask of the United States. Benedict Anderson, right, the guy who said nations are imagined communities, argues that the idea of the nation emerges in Latin America. And I think he's not wrong in that. As we saw, right, we see Benjamin Franklin referring to his people as English, and that is distinct, I think, from this imagining of ourselves as separate, which you see in Latin America, right? The move from Las Españas, like the Spains, which was in common use, right, for these places, to different national identities, and the idea of this is we and it's us versus them. Is, I think, one that, or we are the we, they are the them, is one I think that is useful. So we're moving on now to discuss the revolution in France. The revolution in France, I won't say it's the beginning of a democratic impulse, but it is a major change in how elites are forced to see the world, because the guillotine has emerged, right? And we see this being led by Bonaparte, right? This guy who was once a corporal and is now a consul. I will leave you to read the events yourself. Edmund Burke, right, English philosopher. This is the responses to this revolution determined the nature of politics for much of the next century. Edmund Burke sees a revolution as akin to a jailbreak. It's this idea, it's deeply conservative, right, that the people revolting have no right to be doing so, and that they should not be involved in their own governance. He sees little value in the ideologies that emerge for it, and he begins to come up with this idea of reform to preserve. We have to give these people a little so they don't take a lot. We see the social contract, right? Now, the social contract is an idea that it is in place today. Normally, when Locke, Rousseau, etc., talk about the social contract, they do so in terms of like a thought experiment, right? Like, would we enter into the state if we lived in a state of nature and could choose to enter into the state? There are people who do this in practice, right? Like in Rojava, a place in northern East Syria, like they have a social contract. People endorse it and vote on. In many of our cases, though, it's this theoretical thing. It's based on what I would consider to be the very flawed assumption that life is, to quote Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature. I think this is an imagining of the state of nature that exists from people who assume the state to be the natural order of human beings, and therefore imagine what life will be without the state to be less ideal, less optimal, and they do this from the perspective of the state, right? From having been born, raised, and lived in a state and not really be able to imagine life outside of the state. In fact, human beings have existed without the state for centuries. Their lives were neither nasty nor brutish nor short. And in fact, people have been able to live in peace and harmony without the state. This is in part due to people like Hobbes ignoring a large part of indigenous history, not being aware of it, right? History of the indigenous people, especially of the Americas, right? The idea of the state would have been somewhat anathema to some people. If you're interested more in sort of problematizing this idea as a state of the perfect end goal of human civilization, I'd recommend some of David Graeber's books, Dawn of Everything, which he wrote with David Wengrow, being a very good one, also a very long one. You can also look at James C. Scott, would be another person to read. I highly recommend both of those. Let me know if you want more suggestions. I'm going to skip past these because we don't have much time. And then we look at Haiti, right? Interesting place. What we see here is a combination of things, right? We see this thing called Foucault's boomerang, which is the sort of the violence of, well, a little bit, I suppose, not entirely, because it's not being visited in the metropole. But what we mainly see is the French Revolution being kind of called on its hypocrisy, right? If you believe in liberty, equality, and fraternity, why are we not treated with these qualities, right? With these things, right? Why are we, the black people, even the poor biracial people, treated so terribly here? We see within decades of the American Revolution, the United States joining against the same revolution, which incorporates essentially the same ideas in Haiti, right? We see the United States stepping in, supporting the role of France here, the role of the oppressor, the role of the colonizer, the idea that the United States Revolution was anti-colonial and about freedom and justice for everyone, I think is deeply problematized by this and other things, right? Like, who got the freedom? It's hard not to see it as at least partially racial lines, right? Again, some details, right? Details of the revolution I'd like you to read. You can see them in that specific lecture. Toussaint Louverture, right? One of these leaders, leaders of the revolt. And you can see some of these contemporary paintings, right? Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my time. I think what I want you to really take from the week is what freedom means and who it's for. And think about that, right? I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm not telling you what to conclude, but I think hopefully some of these examples will allow you to think about that in a more educated way, which is what we're doing here in history, right? We're thinking about the past with more education, with more insight. Okay, hope you have a good week.